So, Professor Fegert will now present developments in safeguarding theories as an introduction to the topics presented by the researchers in the poster sessions and the printed posters, which I'm sure will give a very good introduction to and outlook on all those aspects that have been mentioned in the papers. Over to you.
Thank you, Hans. So my lecture this morning was more about my field, about psychiatry, child psychiatry, because I think it's always important to think about the culture where we come from and also to talk about the problems. Now my perspective is in some way a more general, looking at new developments in safeguarding that had been discussed throughout these days, with a perspective on the posters that will be presented here, just as a framework. What? No, sorry. For the next 45-50 minutes, I'm the only person that is between you and the lunch break. I will talk a bit about research in safeguarding and the role of interculturality in safeguarding. And then I will come back to my field with the bad example of institutional boundary transgressions, and you can draw your conclusions on other fields. And another thing I would like to mention is really the influence of technology and AI, because throughout that conference, since the encyclica of Pope Leo, I think it's really a very important issue, and it also has to do with culture and changing culture through the internet. And I will come to a conclusion and perhaps to some speculation for the future. The aim is really to introduce a bit about the growing body of international safeguarding research. When we started together, everybody agreed that we need safeguarding, but there was not a research perspective on that. And often people thought good intentions are enough to do good safeguarding. And we know from research that sometimes good intentions is the way to hell in some ways paved by good intentions. So we really also have to look at the effects and have to evaluate what we are doing. The field of safeguarding is moving from a more top-down compliance mode towards more relational, contextual, and survivor-centered cultures. And I was impressed yesterday by the intervention of Peter Beer, bringing people together and guiding them down here, that really visualized what it means that you can't do it alone. And when you do it together, everybody has to jump in from his or her perspective, and it only works if everybody works together with the same orientation. So that was very, very, very impressive. So we are changing from Western expert models toward an intercultural and decolonial approach, and from isolated child protection towards holistic safeguarding ecosystems. And that is also important for the new challenges in the internet, because we have a special vulnerability, for example, of mentally handicapped persons that often believe that AI companions are real companions, and they confess everything to the AI and the technological firms that are behind them. So we also have to think in these new technologies, what they bring in kind of chances, but of special risks for special vulnerable groups. And therefore, I think we need a whole ecosystem with standards we all agree on, and then with adapted measures. So we did once research in children's institutions and asked the people that worked there about their safeguarding concept. And that was after the German Bishops' Conference and others had a general safeguarding concept, and you could be sure that in every Catholic institution in Germany there was a safeguarding concept. But it was not alive. Yeah? And I really like that citation. Our safeguarding concept is in a folder, but I don't know where that folder currently is. So a good concept doesn't help you if you don't have a common attitude. Yeah? And we have to live our concepts, and we have to adapt our concepts. So it's not about concepts, it's about attitudes and working together. And if we look at safeguarding theories, historically we had a lot of debates on legal compliance, and still we have seen that the talk about church law and the legal framework always gives us orientation, and we seek for orientation. But law is only a framework. We have the orientation also inside. Yeah? It has to come from our heart, as has been said yesterday. Yeah? We have to know in some way what is right and what is wrong. And historically it was a lot about risk management, about control, and a lot of one-size-fits-all frameworks. And if we have the same safeguarding framework in a kindergarten, and for example in an institution of adolescents from a problem background where about 70% of the girls had been abused before, and a lot of boys had been already being abusing others, that cannot fit. There is no one-size-fits-all solution. We really have to do a risk analysis in the special situation and in the specific culture. We have common principles, but then we have to adapt it to the place we work in. And I think there are some strengths in these universal standards. There is a strength in accountability, transparency, and the general recognition of abuse as a very prevalent problem. And that changed really. When I started in medicine more than 40 years ago, nobody talked about that. And in my career, I couldn't do my PhD on child abuse, although it was my research field all the 45 years long. But my professor at that time said, that has nothing to do with medicine, it's social work, just do something medically sound. And this has completely changed, and therefore I'm proud about the thing you mentioned, that we will have now the National Trauma Research Center in Germany with cooperative interdisciplinary research. So many things have changed in the acknowledgement that abuse is abuse of power, and it occurs in many, many situations. Still, we have a lot of limitations, like culturally blind assumptions, insufficient survivor participation, little reflection on abuse in many situations, and weak engagement with spirituality and local acknowledgement systems. And we have seen it from the lectures this morning, how important this is. Yeah? You have to involve the local culture and make it part of it, and you have to use the local hierarchies to be behind these measures. So Safeguarding is increasingly understood as participatory, intercultural, relational, community-based, trauma-informed, and spiritually aware. And I want to raise your attention to some papers I mentioned here on the right side that are in the poster sessions or in the printed out poster that you just find when you leave the room. And please use also the lunch break to look at these posters, because people who prepare the posters spend a lot of time in bringing their ideas in. And when we look at central premises in the development of safeguarding concept, I think it's very important that we understand these concepts as a continuous process. We never end with that. And again, from my perspective of the hospital, we have a rapid turnover of young doctors because they are trained in a university and then they go to other fields. So we have to restart every time to rebuild a common attitude. It's never finished. You don't have the concept in your folder and pack it away, but it's a constant development process. It must be participatory, must be understood. It must include the establishment of an open culture to learn from errors, mistake, and failure. We often think we have to be perfect, yeah? But in everyday life, mistakes happen, and we can learn from these mistakes. But I learned during the seminaries I did together with Ulrike here at the GREC, that in several cultures it's nearly impossible to criticize a doctor, just with respect to hierarchy. So we have to think about how we can make it able, yeah? How the whole group that sees something can tell it to a superior in hierarchy that what he does is not okay, and I will come to this again. So for us, and I showed this graph, I think every time I was here, but still it's one of the basic foundations. You cannot only think about institution as a place of protection and to fight for safe institutions if you don't have also the competence in the institution to deal with cases of abuse. Yeah? Because often institutions like hospitals, institutions for children, school, are the places where abused children seek help. Yeah? So a safeguarding concept that does not concentrate also on the way how we can help children, that only looks at how we can hinder dangers from our system, yeah, I think is in some way limited. We need both expertises. Yeah? We have to create safe places for children and vulnerable persons, but we also have to have the competence to hear the problems of the people that come to us and make it clear that we have open ears to hear it. Yeah? And then we have to look in the hierarchy. We talked a bit, what do I do if a patient tells me something under the secret of confession and the information is important to the doctors? Yes, you have to empower the patient to utter this to the doctor. You can't bring that secret to the doctor. You can't be instrumentalized within the medical system. And you remember my graph with different hierarchies. Yeah? So we always have to work with the patients and find an alliance with the people that confess to us things to find out how we can help them. So we have these values like respect of human dignity, respect for rights and needs of each individual. And we have the concept of promotion of self-determination and autonomy very much in Western cultures. And this does not work in every cultural context. So even if we go to the main principles in prevention, we sometimes overestimate the side of empowerment of vulnerable and weak persons. And we sometimes have to have much more in mind the collective perspective, how the group can make situations safer. So what is going on is that safeguarding has also become a market. And in some way, it might be helpful that there are services that provide concepts to institutions, but I'm always a bit critical about it because I think it can be yes, support or help, but finally safeguarding has to develop in the institution, has to develop in the community, and people should be identified with the concept. So the exclusive development of these things by safeguarding officers, abuse prevention officers, in some way takes away that responsibility from us that we all have with respect to vulnerable persons. And I think for an institution, everybody at his or her level has to take care for safeguarding. Yeah? So that can be an impulse, but it has to be a common attitude where we work. And it's an ongoing process, as I said. So if you look at the role of interculturality, we have in funding an increasing formal pressure to have a safeguarding framework to get funding. A person from Miserio yesterday mentioned that conflict, and it's in some way an intercultural or perhaps also a post-colonial conflict, and it's often perceived like that. And that in some way can discredit the importance of safeguarding. And I think we have to have a debate with funders and projects how we can do appropriate, risk-appropriate and culture-appropriate safeguarding in these projects. Because I also think you can't say, no, we don't have a concept. I think that the principle that we only want to fund projects where we are sure that there is a safe ambience for vulnerable persons is okay. But the way how we enforce it, I think that should be much more negotiated. And it should be adopted with really knowledge about the local situation and context. So finally, concepts should be owned by the person they use it and not imported. And I have that example from my own university. In Germany and many European countries, for a long time, if you applied for a research fund, you always had to fill in a paragraph on women's rights and gender mainstreaming. And at my university, there is an office on gender mainstreaming, and if you prepare an application, they write you a paragraph about this. So we comply, but it has nothing to do with the attitude, for example, of the surgeons. So it has become a routine, just to get the money, but it didn't change anything in the real life. And I think we should avoid these bad examples when we talk about safeguarding. It's about a dialogue, and it's about attitude, and it's about our personal hearts. And it's not complying with a rule just to get the money and then doing what I always wanted to do. Yeah. When we look at interculturality as an adaptation, we have some good examples in the posters and in the printed posters and in the sessions. For example, from Albania, where policies are adapted into Catholic education, or the Catholic Safeguarding Standards Agency using an audit model across cultures. And I think audits are very appropriate to find out what are the strengths and weaknesses you have at the moment and how you can develop further your safeguarding process. So I think that's a very adequate methodology. And there's another poster on safeguarding compliance in Uganda, humanitarian program, and I really strongly recommend it to you to look at these posters. And there's also interculturality as mutual learning. With the new questions we raised during that conference, whose understanding of childhood, whose model of family, whose concept of vulnerability, whose understanding of authority and dignity, because we have different understandings of the same, concepts. Yeah. In my first talk, I talked a lot about the concepts, but we have different understanding of that. And there are posters like the critique of the white normative child voice, or safeguarding as translation and not transplantation to another culture, or mistrust of safeguarding as external control that raise this question. Yeah? And then we have intercultural challenges that are identified: universal rights versus local traditions, safeguarding versus authority and power relationships, reporting obligations versus sacramental secrecy, gender justice versus patriarchal systems, child agency versus community hierarchies, the role of the whole family, the role of minorities that want to be projected towards the general society, secular framework, versus spiritual worldviews. So there are a lot of tensions, that we only can deal with in a dialogue. And for example, there are posters, India, Seal of Confession, or from the Côte d'Ivoire, patriarchal violence norms, then something about Roma culture communities, with the importance of spirituality as a background, or African women, religious obedience and silence cultures. Yeah, so I really recommend you to look at these posters. I come back to my work, and we did a study on prevalence of sexual harassment in academic medicine, because during the coffee break, a young colleague, a psychotherapist, approached me and said, we hear so much about in our training about boundaries and respect. How can it happen that there is so much abuse in the medical field? And that was also the question we were wondering for. And often, as with kids, it's the example of the parents, of the adults, or here of the superiors in the hospital. And if you look at our recent publication, you see that sexual harassment in academic medicine is not a rare event, it's very, very frequent. So we did a study in all the university hospitals in the state of Baden-Württemberg, that's the state where I'm working, and we had 1,400 doctors and 2,300 nurses who responded to that questionnaire. So it's really a huge number, and I was proud about, because they were confident that we really use that very sensitive data in a good manner. And we found out that the lifetime prevalence, so during the whole life, 75%, three-quarters of all female physicians, but also 50% of the male physicians had survived some form of sexual harassment at the working place. Yeah? So in hospitals, it's very, very frequent. Yeah? And for the nurses, it's even worse. And you see the power of hierarchy. And that are similar numbers compared to another survey at the Charité Hospital in Berlin. And if you just look what happened during the last year, because lifetime, that is very long. So last year, a third of the female physicians and a good quarter of the male young physicians reported about harassment at the workplace. And in such a context, it is very difficult to enforce a safeguarding structure if the adults misbehave. And you never know whether the hierarchy is with you, because they all are guilty in some way, yeah? And everybody sees it and everybody knows it, yeah? And that's a big problem, and you can, I think, transfer it to other fields, yeah? I just have the data from the medical field, but I think that's really a very important thing. And we had that big chance to work with your students here on the medical field, and we looked at intercultural challenges in hierarchies in healthcare, and the issue of, am I able to utter critique, to say what I'm seeing, yeah? To really trust my feeling and to bring it in. It's a very, very big issue, and I give you some citations. In my culture, it would, for example, be impossible for a nurse to point out a problem or a mistake to a doctor because of the hierarchy. And as a result, both patients and subordinate staff are often not protected from the arbitrariness of those higher up in the hierarchy. So it's even dangerous from a medical point of view. If a nurse sees that there is wrong medication given to a patient, yeah, it's of utmost importance that she stops the doctor. But the students told us, in my culture, that is not possible. Yeah? And if we just change the field and go to Korea, in the Korean Airways system 30 years ago, they had the most accidents, airplane accidents in the world. And what was the reason? The co-pilot culturally could not intervene if the pilot made a mistake for the hierarchy, because he couldn't criticize his superior. So willingly and seeingly, they flew into the mountain because of these difficulties. And they started very big training programs on changing culturally appropriate attitudes with respect to this risk, and they dramatically reduced the risk of accidents. Yeah? So we have to think about what is our general aim, and in medicine it's first do no harm. Yeah? And to follow this aim, you have to criticize a person that does harm and perhaps doesn't remark it. Yeah? So we have to think about our cultural ideas and to find a way how to deal with that. And if we want to have a safeguarding principle, so they took me as an example of an elder person here. Yeah, we have to talk about the possibilities of critique. And that was a really, really fascinating workshop, yeah? Because we talked about the same things from very different perspectives. The other thing is a methodological challenge. We also need international benchmarks, and we lack translations of instruments from one to other countries, and it's difficult to translate instruments and to adapt it culturally. But we also need a monitoring, a worldwide monitoring, and a world that is changing very much with the new technologies. We really need to see whether child protection is deteriorating and it's getting worse with all the influences from the internet, or whether we are successful in protecting vulnerable persons. So we need these translations, like, for example, in the instrument of the International Society of Child Protection, where you can freely download versions in many, many languages, and where all other people are welcome to produce new translations and to bring it in to test it. And the International Society of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry that will meet next week in Hamburg, they said that there is an increasing tension between a uniform, globalized youth culture via the internet and the local cultures, and we have to take that into account and also to speak with youth about that, because they are exposed also to sexual details that nobody imagined 20 years ago. Yeah? So there is a tremendous change, and we have to think about reporting standards and about the diversity, and often geographically and culturally diverse populations are not included in research. Yeah? All the research on the new consequences of the internet are very much focused on the Western world. Yeah? And we have to think about that problem, because the problems reach everybody, but the research on protection is only done mostly in the Western world. Yeah? And we have a lack of data. And there is one big survey just published called Our Voice, Survivor Experiences of Online Abuse. And they show that children from many, many different countries have the same issues. The shame about what happened, it's guilt feelings, it's a fear of being no longer loved. The consequence is often social isolation and not being taken seriously, and a fear of negative consequences. And I think in our context we have to address that, and to say, as a competent institution or as a competent person, you can always come to me, even if you made a mistake, even if you opened a site that you shouldn't have opened. We have to speak about that, and it's not primarily the moral judgment, but I see you have been hurt, you are ashamed, and we have to talk about that, how you could cope better with that. So we have a change of perspective from child protection to more holistic safeguarding, to safeguarding ecosystems, as I called it. And we have examples from posters presented here this afternoon and outside about adult clergy abuse, dignity restoration approaches, and so on. And I think it's important, and Hansu was one of the first who said we should not only focus on children. And still, in many contexts, it's only the Catholic Church that says it's protection from abuse for vulnerable populations, and also includes vulnerable adults, and the elderly, my example, are also a very vulnerable population, because they are relying on care and support. And we have a change from expert-led to participatory models, and we can support that and include for example, young people or vulnerable people. In Germany, I think it's now more than 20 years ago, the first conference with mentally handicapped people, with translation during the conference and outbreak groups with mentally handicapped people on sexual abuse in institutions for mentally handicapped people. And at the beginning was very difficult even to get the funding for that, because people thought it's impossible. But it worked, and it was also educational for us to use simple words, yeah, to say important things in simple words, yeah, and not hiding us behind our research language. And good research often can be explained with very, very simple words, yeah, and that's the question of research communication and participation. So, but But we have the risk that participation now is also an obligation that you have, and you invite people to participate, but finally there is no co-production, and they are not part in the decision, and it's in some way it's window dressing. And we really have to think about how we support people that speak from the victim perspective, also financially. If they come to a meeting, usually if I go to a meeting, everything is arranged for me, my travel costs are taken over, I'm reimbursed, and I'm insured. Many volunteers are not. And we have to think about the whole bureaucracy of participation and how we really support them as part of the process. And that is sometimes very difficult. And here you have a publication from Wright and others that's from 2010, and that shows you that we have very different steps of participation. And I'm very glad that we included now in the process that we do for Mrs. von der Leyen, a young girl from Portugal. She just turned 18 at our first meeting in Brussels, into the production of the report. Yeah? And she reads all our paragraphs and brings in her generational perspective. And we had in the meetings representatives from the generation, but she's now at the level of co-production in the process. So if we come to procedural compliance to dignity restoration, we have examples from the poster sessions that I mentioned here: safeguarding beyond compliance, working with survivors, spirituality-informed safeguarding, communal holding places. All these examples are about attitudes, yeah? How we integrate that into our community. And I think that's a very important field. If you allow, Hans, I will mention shortly what we are doing in Brussels at the moment, and if you still can follow, if it's not an overload. This was the first meeting of that special panel, and we will submit the report on the 13th of July, and then it will be publicly accessible, first in English, and during the summer it will be translated in all the languages of the European Union. And we have to see that this digital world developed very, very rapidly. And artificial intelligence developed only during the last years. Yeah? So it's a very, very rapid development. And we have a strong increase of sexual abuse in the internet. We did 2 representative studies in Germany to look at online child sexual abuse and to look at online child sexual solicitation, grooming, and all these other things. And we used a questionnaire from David Finkelhor to look on commercial sexual talk, commercial sex material that is often done from people in Germany, in rich countries, to kids in the Philippines. So there is also a transcultural perspective in the exploitation of children. And online commercial exploitation is really growing, is exploding throughout the world, and exploits the power differences between the global south and the rich north. So I think that's a very important thing. Then also image-based sexual abuse with all these new AI nudification apps, and I was very lucky and happy that the EU resulted in a decision on a new legislation that hindered these nudification apps. So AI that makes a nude photo of a normal person photo, child photo. And we have all that field of grooming, where also in game platforms adult come in, pretend to be a youngster, and get in contact and ask for nude photos and things like that. And in the German population, you see that these transgressions are very, very frequent. Yeah? About 20% if you take all together. But that's only half the truth, because this is the general population. But if we go to the youngest group, more than 30% have lived through these experiences. And the younger the kids are, the more of these experiences they have. And therefore, it's so important for me also to talk about that with you, because that is something that happens in all cultures. But often you don't have the means to measure it and to do this kind of studies. And we have a change in victim gender, because normally, it's not normal, but in our real-world data, about 80% of the victims of sexual abuse are girls. It's a bit different in abuse by priests, where we have more boys, usually. But in the internet, where perpetrators that have an interest in boys can find their victims by algorithms, yeah? We have half boys, half girls. So it changes also our thinking about preventing and what are the risk groups, because you can address people at risk much easily now in the net. And we know that also from abuse in the internet, we have consequences on well-being and trauma. And if you go to adolescents, in Germany, they report you last year that a quarter of them had contacts with unintentional pornographic content in the internet. So it's really a very, very big issue. Last thing, we are doing a study with sexually abused girls versus girls that had the luck to grow up without any traumata, to compare their behavior in the internet. And the thing that I want to tell you about this study is that kids that had been abused in the real-world setting have much more risk to be re-abused in the internet. In our representative studies, 60% of the abused in the real world get re-abused in the net. And that has something to do with the distorted interest in sexual things they have from their original abuse. So if we do therapy, if we try to talk about healing, we also have to talk about the fascination that pornography has on these kids and the risks that their behavior, because they always leave traces in the internet. Yeah? All these companies collect personal data and get profiles, and the perpetrators also can do it. We really have to address these issues as a safeguarding issue. And at the moment, I think the discussion is lacking these new dangers, where we have to accompany kids and have to have recommendations about it. So I come to the conclusion: safeguarding is no longer merely procedural, merely legal, merely institutional. It's increasingly intercultural, and I think these days here they're very impressive. It's more and more a dialogue. It has to be survivor-informed, digitally aware, and I'm so glad, Hans, that next year we will be able to talk about these dangers here, ethically reflective and globally interconnected. And one commitment, many contexts means for me safeguarding principles, maybe universal, as the principles of the doctors I showed you this morning. But trust, dignity, healing, authority, and protection are always culturally embodied. I thank you very, very much for your long attention.